It was a warm afternoon, the kind that made you want to relax. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the streets with long shadows that stretched across the quiet neighborhood. There was a stillness in the air, the kind of stillness that made the day feel almost too quiet, like something was missing. Two patrol officers, Jenkins and Malone, sat in their squad car, slowly cruising through the streets, keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. It was their usual routine, driving through the same neighborhoods, seeing the same houses, the same people. Nothing ever really happened here, at least not anything exciting. But they were on duty, and their job was to keep watch. Jenkins tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, glancing out the window. Malone sat next to him, arms crossed, looking just as bored. "Another slow day," Jenkins muttered, glancing at Malone. "Not much going on." Malone nodded, letting out a small sigh. "Too quiet," he agreed. "I almost wish something would happen, just to break the boredom." And then, as if their wish was granted, they saw him. A teenage boy, no older than 16, walked down the sidewalk, his hoodie pulled up over his head, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He was walking alone, head down, not making eye contact with anyone. His steps were slow and steady, as if he wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. Jenkins and Malone exchanged a quick glance. The boy caught their attention immediately. He fit a certain profile, at least in their minds. A young black kid, wearing a hoodie, alone on the street. He had to be up to something, right? "Let's check him out," Jenkins said, his voice low but firm. He turned the wheel, guiding the squad car toward the curb where the boy was walking. Malone didn't need to be convinced. "Yeah," he agreed, sitting up a little straighter in his seat. "Let's see what he's up to." The car came to a slow stop just a few feet from the boy. He didn't seem to notice them at first. He kept walking, his head still down, as if he hadn't realized the police were there. Or maybe he didn't care. Jenkins and Malone stepped out of the car, their badges gleaming in the fading sunlight. They approached the boy with purpose, their eyes narrowed. They were the law here, and they were used to people responding to that. To them, this was just another routine stop. Another kid who probably wouldn't know how to answer their questions, someone they could push around a little to remind him who was in charge. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. "Hey, kid!" Jenkins called out, his voice sharp, cutting through the quiet street. The boy finally looked up. His face was calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been stopped by the police. His eyes met Jenkins, but there was no fear in them. He just stared back, his expression unreadable. Malone stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his voice a little harsher. "You live around here?" The boy didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at the two officers. His calmness seemed to annoy them. "I said, what are you doing here?" Malone repeated, his patience thinning. He took a step closer, trying to intimidate the boy. The boy finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Just walking," he said, his tone even, as if he didn't understand why they were stopping him. "Just walking." Jenkins echoed, his eyebrows raised. He didn't believe it for a second. "Where are you going?" The boy shrugged, his hands still in his pockets. "Nowhere. Just walking." That answer didn't sit well with Jenkins. He looked at Malone, a silent conversation passing between them. They didn't like the way this kid was acting. He wasn't scared, wasn't nervous. He was just calm. Too calm. And that made them suspicious. "Take your hands out of your pockets," Malone ordered, his voice growing more commanding. The boy did as he was told, slowly pulling his hands out of his pockets and holding them at his sides. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet defiance that the officers didn't like. "Let's see what you've got," Jenkins said, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to search the boy. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't feel like he needed to. After all, this was just another kid, right? But as he started to pat the boy down, there was nothing. No weapons, no drugs, nothing suspicious. Jenkins frowned, his frustration growing. He had expected to find something, anything that would justify the stop. "Empty your pockets," Malone demanded, his tone rougher now. He wasn't happy either. The boy stayed silent, reaching into his pockets and pulling out a phone, a few crumpled bills, and a set of keys. He held them out for the officers to see, his expression still calm, still steady. "Is that it?" Jenkins asked, his voice thick with disbelief. The boy nodded. "That's it?" Jenkins and Malone exchanged another glance. They didn't like this. Not one bit. Something about this kid was off. He wasn't scared, wasn't nervous like most people were when the police stopped them. He just stood there, waiting, as if he knew something they didn't. "Why are you walking around here?" Jenkins asked again, trying to push the boy into giving a different answer. "I told you," the boy said, his voice still calm. "I'm just walking." The tension in the air was thick now. Jenkins and Malone didn't know what to do. They couldn't arrest the kid for just walking, but they didn't want to let him go either. Something about him made them uneasy. But before they could say anything else, something happened that neither of them expected. A sleek black car rolled up behind the squad car, the engine purring softly. Jenkins and Malone turned to look, their eyes narrowing as the car came to a stop. The door opened, and a man stepped out, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. He moved with confidence, his expression calm but serious. The boy's eyes flickered as he saw the man, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But Jenkins and Malone didn't notice. They were too focused on the man approaching them. "Officers," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jenkins straightened up, his posture becoming more formal as he recognized the man. It was Chief Anderson, their boss. He wasn't in uniform, but they knew him immediately. Jenkins shot a quick look at Malone, who was now standing at attention. "Chief," Jenkins stammered, a bit caught off guard. "We were just, doing a routine check." This kid looked suspicious. Chief Anderson's eyes shifted from Jenkins to the boy, and for the first time, his expression changed. His gaze softened as he looked at the boy, and a knowing look passed between them. "Suspicious?" Anderson repeated, his voice still calm but with an edge to it. He turned back to Jenkins and Malone, his face hardening slightly. "This kid happens to be my son." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Jenkins and Malone's faces drained of color as they processed what their boss had just said. His son? The boy they had just stopped, searched, and treated like a suspect. He was the son of the police chief? The boy, who had been silent through most of the encounter, finally spoke again, his voice just as calm as before. "I was just walking, like I said." Chief Anderson's gaze never left his son's face. There was a deep understanding in his eyes, a silent exchange that Jenkins and Malone couldn't fully grasp. Anderson turned back to his officers, his expression now cold and unreadable. "You've been profiling again, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low but dangerous. "I warned you about this. I told you there would be no tolerance for this kind of behavior in my department." Jenkins tried to stammer out an excuse. "Chief, we didn't know." "It doesn't matter if you knew," Anderson interrupted, his tone sharp. "You assumed. You stopped my son because of how he looked. You didn't have any real reason, did you?" Malone looked like he wanted to disappear. His face had gone pale, and he was visibly shaking now. He knew they were in serious trouble. Chief Anderson took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing at the two officers. "You're both suspended," he said firmly. "Effective immediately. And there will be a full investigation into your conduct." Jenkins opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it. There was nothing he could say. He and Malone had made a huge mistake, and now they were going to face the consequences. "Get back to the station and turn in your badges," Anderson ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The two officers nodded, their heads hanging low as they walked back to the squad car, their steps heavy with the weight of what had just happened. As they drove away, Jenkins glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Chief Anderson placed a hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him toward the black car. The boy didn't say much, but the small smile on his face said everything. He had known who had the real power in this situation all along. He didn't need to raise his voice or get angry. He had let the situation play out, knowing that in the end, justice would be served. As Jenkins and Malone disappeared down the street, the boy looked up at his father. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. Chief Anderson gave him a small smile in return. "You didn't need me to step in," he said. "You handled yourself just fine." The boy stood there, silent and still, his hands casually tucked deep in his hoodie pockets. Jenkins and Malone exchanged a look, both noticing how the boy didn't even flinch when they pulled up beside him. He didn't seem worried, not in the way that most people did when the police approached. Most kids would get nervous, maybe even scared. But not him. He just stood there, almost as if he was waiting. Jenkins puffed out his chest, trying to project authority. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing around here? Got something to hide?" The boy's eyes slowly rose to meet Jenkins' gaze. His face was calm, almost emotionless. His eyes were steady, but there was something in them that Jenkins couldn't quite figure out. "Just walking," the boy replied softly. His voice was quiet, but it held a certain calmness. He wasn't intimidated, wasn't rushing to make an excuse. He simply stated the truth, or at least that's what he wanted them to believe. Malone didn't like that one bit. He didn't like the way the kid was looking at them, like he was too comfortable. Like he didn't care that they were the police. So Malone took a step forward, getting closer, trying to tower over the boy. He had to remind him who was in charge. "Walking, huh?" Malone sneered. "Let's see what you got on you." He reached for the boy's pockets without asking, without a second thought. He was already assuming that this was just another routine search, another kid who wouldn't know how to stand up to them. But this time was different. The boy didn't move, didn't flinch. His body stayed perfectly still, his hands still tucked deep in his pockets. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Jenkins and Malone exchanged another glance, and they both felt it, the unease. This kid wasn't acting like any other person they had stopped. There was no panic, no fear. Just calm. Too calm. Jenkins frowned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He expected the kid to get nervous. He expected him to squirm, to try and make excuses, to beg them to let him go. But instead, the boy just stood there, eyes locked on them. It was unnerving. Malone's hand hovered near the boy's jacket, ready to search him. But before he could make a move, Jenkins stepped in with a warning, his voice tinged with irritation. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, kid," he said, his tone low but dangerous. "Just tell us what you're doing here and we'll be done with it." But still, the boy didn't answer in the way they expected. He didn't get scared. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, waiting. His eyes were calm, almost as if he already knew how this was going to go. He didn't care what they thought of him, didn't care what they were going to do. He just waited. Jenkins' patience was wearing thin. He hated the way the kid was acting. It wasn't normal. Everyone else they stopped reacted in one of two ways: either they were scared, or they tried to argue. But this boy, he was neither of those things. He was calm, too calm, and it was making Jenkins angry. "All right, kid," Malone said, a little more forcefully this time. "Hands out of your pockets." The boy's gaze never wavered. Slowly, he brought his hands out from his pockets and held them out in front of him, palms open, showing that he wasn't hiding anything. He didn't seem angry or frustrated, he just seemed indifferent. Jenkins reached out to pat the boy down, checking his pockets. There was nothing, no weapons, no drugs, nothing that could explain why they had stopped him. Just a phone, some crumpled bills, and a set of keys. That was it. Nothing out of the ordinary. Jenkins's frustration grew. "Empty your pockets," he demanded, his voice rising just a little. But the boy didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He just pulled out everything from his pockets and placed it in his hands, showing them that there was nothing to hide. Malone frowned. This wasn't what they had expected. They had thought they'd find something. Anything. They didn't want to admit it, but it was beginning to dawn on them that they had no real reason to be searching the boy. There was nothing suspicious about him. But Jenkins wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet." "Is that it?" Jenkins asked, trying to sound tougher than he felt. He was starting to feel like they were wasting their time, but he wasn't about to admit it. The boy nodded once. "That's it?" Jenkins's jaw tightened. He didn't like this. Not one bit. But instead of admitting that they had no reason to stop him, he doubled down. He couldn't let the boy get away with making him feel foolish. "So you're just walking around, doing nothing, huh?" The boy didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at Jenkins. There was something in his eyes, something that made Jenkins feel like the boy was seeing right through him. He didn't seem bothered by the questions, didn't seem worried about the situation at all. He was simply waiting. "I told you already," the boy finally said, his voice calm and even. "Just walking." It was like he was giving them an opportunity to make this easier on themselves, to just let him go. But Jenkins wasn't ready to let him off the hook. "Not yet." "You're not from around here, are you?" Jenkins asked, trying to make the situation more complicated. He needed a reason to keep the boy there, to make this stop feel justified. But the boy didn't answer immediately. He just kept his eyes on them, still not showing any fear. "I'm just walking," he repeated, his voice still soft, but this time there was a hint of something else, something that made Jenkins stop. He wasn't sure if it was confidence or something else, but it made him pause. The boy wasn't playing the game the way he was supposed to. Malone stepped forward again, his eyes narrowing. He didn't like this. He didn't like being made to feel like the kid was in control. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice low. "We're done playing games. What are you really doing here?" The boy just stood there. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. He didn't seem to care what they asked him. He was still waiting. It was like he knew this was going to happen. He knew what was coming next. Jenkins's frustration finally broke through. "You're not talking, huh?" he said. "Well, we don't need you to talk. We're taking you in." Malone nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we'll figure it out at the station." The boy's eyes flickered for just a moment, but he didn't say anything. He didn't fight back, didn't try to run. He just stood there, letting them make the next move. But then, just as Jenkins reached for the boy's arm, there was a sound, a car approaching. Slowly at first, the low hum of an engine in the distance. Jenkins and Malone turned toward the noise, still holding on to the boy. The tension in the air shifted. The arrival of the car changed everything. They didn't know who it was, but it didn't matter. Whoever it was, they had already been interrupted. The car pulled up behind the squad car, its engine cutting off with a soft purr. The tension in the air thickened. The two officers exchanged a quick glance, but they didn't release their hold on the boy. Something about the situation didn't sit right, but they were too deep in now. The door of the car opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit. He walked toward them with an easy confidence, his eyes scanning the situation. The moment he saw the boy, his face softened, and his posture shifted. Jenkins and Malone didn't know who this man was, but the way he moved, the way the boy's eyes followed him, told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't just any stranger. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "What's going on here?" Jenkins and Malone froze, their gazes shifting from the boy to the man. The quiet tension that had filled the air moments ago was now replaced by a new kind of unease. Something had just changed. They could feel it. The boy's calmness wasn't an accident. There was something else happening here, something they hadn't seen coming. Jenkins and Malone continued their search, each moment of silence making the tension heavier. They found nothing. No weapons. No drugs. Nothing suspicious at all. It didn't make sense. The boy was acting like someone who had nothing to hide, but the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was too calm, too composed. And that just didn't sit well with Jenkins. The streets were quiet, the sound of the boy's steady breathing filling the silence between the officers. Jenkins frowned. How could he not be scared? Most people would be panicking by now, but not this kid. Malone didn't like the look of things. He was getting frustrated too. He had been pushing the boy around, trying to make him react, but all he got in return was calmness. It made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "Who do you think you are, walking around here like this?" Jenkins sneered, trying to sound intimidating. His voice was sharp, trying to mask his own growing discomfort. But the boy didn't flinch. He didn't show any signs of fear or anger. He just stood there, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said quietly, his voice calm and even. It wasn't the response Jenkins had hoped for. He had expected the boy to get nervous, to offer some kind of excuse, but the kid didn't seem bothered at all. It wasn't normal. The more Jenkins looked at him, the more his frustration grew. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The kid wasn't afraid, and that made Jenkins uncomfortable. People were supposed to get scared when the cops showed up. People were supposed to act guilty, even if they weren't. But this boy, he just stood there like he knew he was in control. Malone, sensing the change in the atmosphere, took a step closer, shoving the boy slightly with his shoulder. "You better watch your tone, kid," he growled, trying to make the boy cower. "We don't need a reason to take you in." But the boy didn't even budge. He didn't flinch or move away. He just stood there, as if he had all the time in the world. It was almost like he was daring them to try something. Jenkins watched him closely. There was something about the way the boy was standing, something in his eyes. It was almost like he knew what was coming next. Like he had seen this all before and knew exactly how it was going to play out. Jenkins could feel the pressure building inside him. He wanted to break the kid, make him admit something, anything that would justify what they were doing. But the boy wasn't cooperating. He wasn't giving them anything. The kid's eyes flickered for just a second, a brief moment where it almost looked like he was about to say something, but then he closed his mouth and said nothing. It was as if he was waiting for them to make the next move, watching them with that same calm expression. Jenkins' hand twitched toward his radio, the temptation to call for backup growing stronger with each passing second. He hated feeling like he was losing control. But before he could make the call, something happened. Something unexpected. A sleek black car pulled up behind their squad car, the engine cutting off with a soft purr. At first, Jenkins and Malone didn't notice it. They were too focused on the boy, too wrapped up in the growing tension. But the boy noticed immediately. His eyes flickered toward the car, and for the first time, Jenkins saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't fear or surprise, it was recognition. The man who stepped out of the car was dressed in a sharp suit, the kind of suit that immediately commanded attention. He walked with confidence, his every step calculated and precise. Jenkins didn't recognize him at first, but the boy's reaction was enough to make Jenkins pause. The boy's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement. It was subtle, but Jenkins noticed it. The boy knew this man. There was no doubt about it. He didn't seem the least bit surprised by the man's arrival. The man approached slowly, his eyes scanning the situation. He took in the two officers, the boy, and the tension hanging in the air. When his gaze landed on the boy, something in his posture shifted. It was a small change, but it was enough to make Jenkins feel uneasy. The man's gaze softened when it rested on the boy. He wasn't angry or concerned, he was calm, almost relieved, as though the boy's presence wasn't a surprise at all. Jenkins and Malone exchanged a confused glance, not sure what to make of the situation. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. It was the kind of voice that commanded attention, the kind of voice that made you want to listen. "What's going on here?" The question wasn't just directed at the officers, it was directed at them with an air of authority, as if he expected an answer. Jenkins and Malone froze, both of them turning to face the man. His calm presence made them feel like they were the ones who had been caught off guard. Jenkins opened his mouth to answer, but for some reason, the words wouldn't come. It wasn't because he didn't know what to say, it was because, in that moment, he realized that they had no good reason to be questioning the boy. They hadn't found anything, and now, with this man showing up, they were out of their depth. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on the man who had just arrived, and in that quiet exchange of glances, something unspoken passed between them. Jenkins couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a connection between them, one that went deeper than he could understand. The man's gaze didn't leave the boy. He didn't even look at Jenkins or Malone. It was like they weren't even there. That only made Jenkins feel more uncomfortable. Who was this man? And why did the boy seem so calm when he saw him? Jenkins tried to regain control of the situation, trying to force himself to remember who was in charge. But the man's presence was overwhelming. It was like the rules had changed, and Jenkins wasn't sure how to play the game anymore. The man didn't wait for an answer. He took another step closer to the boy, his expression now softening even more. "I think you've made your point," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can let him go now." Jenkins stared at him for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Let him go? They hadn't done anything wrong yet, had they? They had every right to keep questioning the boy. They had every right to continue searching him. But something about the man's voice, the way he spoke, made Jenkins hesitate. It was like he was being told to back off, and for some reason, he felt the weight of that command. He didn't want to back down, but the more he stood there, the more it seemed like he didn't have a choice. Malone was still frowning, his eyes darting between the man and the boy. "Who the hell are you?" Malone finally asked, his voice low. He didn't like the way the man was taking control of the situation, and he didn't like the way the boy was standing there so confidently. The man turned to him slowly, his eyes sharp. "I'm someone you don't need to worry about," he said, his tone never changing. "But you can start by worrying about the consequences of making this a bigger issue than it needs to be." There was a brief silence. Jenkins could feel the tension building again, but this time, it wasn't between him and the boy. It was between him and this mysterious man. The threat was subtle, but it was there. Jenkins didn't like it. He didn't like it one bit. The boy didn't speak, but Jenkins could feel his presence in a way that unsettled him. This wasn't just some random kid. There was something more to him. Something that Jenkins and Malone hadn't understood. And it was becoming clearer with each passing second. The man looked back at the boy, his gaze softening. "You're free to go," he said quietly. "No harm done." And just like that, the situation seemed to dissolve. Jenkins and Malone stood there, their jaws clenched, trying to process what had just happened. The boy didn't even look at them as he turned to walk away. The air was thick with tension as the man, who had just appeared, spoke again, his voice smooth and commanding. "Officers," he began, his tone steady and firm, "what's going on here?" Jenkins turned quickly, surprised by the interruption. He hadn't been expecting anyone else, especially not someone like this man. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized him instantly. This wasn't just any person. It was Chief Anderson, their boss. The man who signed their paychecks, the one who held their careers in his hands. Jenkins quickly straightened up, his posture shifting immediately as respect took over. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure after being caught off guard. "Chief, we were just, doing a routine check on this kid," he said, his words coming out awkwardly. He looked suspicious. But as Jenkins spoke, his words seemed to fade, and his focus shifted from his own explanation to the chief's steady gaze. Chief Anderson's eyes didn't look at him, not directly. They were locked on the boy. The boy, who, up until this moment, had seemed like nothing more than a regular teenager. The boy stood there, still, with his hands tucked deep into his hoodie pockets. The casual stance he had taken in the face of the officer's aggression seemed to say everything about him, that he was calm, unruffled, and more than capable of handling whatever had come his way. But now, as Jenkins nervously shifted from foot to foot, the boy finally did something that made Jenkins' stomach churn. For the first time since the encounter had started, the boy smiled. It wasn't a broad grin or a smug smirk, it was a small, knowing smile. As if he had been holding something back, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. Jenkins felt a chill run through him, his confidence beginning to waver. He couldn't quite place why, but that smile seemed so out of place. It seemed to carry some secret that he wasn't privy to. Anderson's gaze softened just slightly, as if the smile had made some sort of shift in his demeanor. His eyes, which had once been hard and unyielding, now held something different. A recognition, perhaps. Something familiar. But there was also a coldness to them, something that made Jenkins' skin crawl. As if this moment was leading to something bigger, something he hadn't been prepared for. "Suspicious, huh?" Chief Anderson said, his voice still smooth but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, something almost dangerous. "This kid happens to be my son." The words hit Jenkins and Malone like a punch to the gut. Their eyes widened, their jaws dropping just slightly. The world seemed to stop, and for a moment, nothing made sense. The boy, the one they had just treated like a criminal, the one they had pushed around, searched, and threatened, was the chief's son? Jenkins felt his heart race. How had they not known? How had they missed it? He looked at the boy, the same boy who had stood there so calmly, so composed, while they harassed him. But now, he saw him in an entirely different light. This wasn't just any kid. This was someone who had power, someone who had connections, someone who could make their lives very difficult if not end their careers altogether. Malone, who had been trying to be tough throughout the whole interaction, now stood frozen, unable to speak. His mouth moved, but no words came out. He could hardly believe it. They had just done everything they could to humiliate the boy, to put him in his place. And now they were learning the truth. Jenkins had a sinking feeling in his stomach, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. He looked back at Chief Anderson, trying to read his face. There was no anger there, no outburst. The chief wasn't shouting at them, wasn't reprimanding them in a loud, harsh way. But the silence between them was deafening. The message was clear: this was bad. This was very, very bad. The boy, who had once stood silently, now shifted his gaze from Chief Anderson to Jenkins and Malone. His smile was gone. In its place was that same calm, steady expression that they had seen before. There was no anger in his eyes, no vengeance. It was almost as if he was watching them with a sense of pity, as if he had already known how this would unfold. He didn't need to say anything. His look was enough. It spoke volumes. Jenkins felt a wave of guilt wash over him, mixing with embarrassment. How could they have not known? He had been so sure of himself earlier, so convinced that they were in control of the situation. But now, with Chief Anderson standing there, his son standing beside him, it felt like everything had crumbled. He glanced at Malone, who was still in shock. Jenkins wasn't sure if Malone had fully processed what had just happened, or if he was still trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. But it didn't matter. The truth had been revealed, and there was no taking it back. Chief Anderson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to put both officers in their place. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on Jenkins' chest. "A big one." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. Jenkins didn't know what to say. What could he say? He could already feel the consequences looming over him, the consequences of their actions. He had underestimated the boy, treated him like any other random kid, not knowing that he was the chief's son. And now, everything was about to change. Malone was still silent, but his face had turned pale. He was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. Jenkins could feel the tension rising, could feel the weight of the chief's gaze on him, heavy with disappointment. It wasn't the kind of anger that made you worry about getting yelled at. It was the kind of anger that made you worry about your future. The kind that made you realize that your career was on the line. The boy finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and full of quiet authority. "I told you I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "But now, I think you'll understand why you don't get to treat me like that." Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The boy's words stung, the truth in them cutting through the air like a knife. The boy wasn't angry, wasn't trying to start a fight. He was simply stating the facts. And that made everything worse. Chief Anderson nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jenkins and Malone. "I'm not going to make a big scene about this," he said. "But I hope you both understand the position you've put yourselves in." The chief's words were like ice, and Jenkins felt a chill run through him. He had no idea how things were going to play out, but he knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. The boy Anderson's son wasn't just some kid to be pushed around. He was someone with power, someone who could change everything for Jenkins and Malone. Chief Anderson's face hardened as he turned back to Jenkins and Malone. The air around them seemed to freeze, the weight of his words settling in like a cold shadow. The silence was deafening. Every moment felt stretched out, every breath heavy with the consequences of their actions. Jenkins and Malone stood there, feeling smaller with each passing second, the tension rising like a storm about to break. "You've been profiling people again, haven't you?" Chief Anderson's voice was low but filled with an unmistakable authority. "I told you this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Not in my department." Jenkins flinched at the words. They hit him harder than he'd expected. He had heard the chief's warnings before, but this was different. This wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was real. And it was happening to him. "Chief, we didn't know," Jenkins began, but his voice faltered. He didn't even believe the words coming out of his mouth. They sounded weak, desperate. He had no excuse for what they'd done. No good reason for treating that boy the way they had. But in that moment, all he could do was stammer, trying to explain away the unexplainable. Anderson cut him off, his tone hard, unyielding. "Doesn't matter if you knew," he said, his voice like steel. "You assumed. You bullied an innocent boy just because of how he looked. That's not how we do things." Jenkins felt the weight of the chief's words press on him, each syllable a reminder of the mistake they had made. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on knowing how to read situations, how to handle them with authority. But today, in front of his boss, he saw how wrong he had been. The realization hit him like a wave, and he struggled to keep his composure. But there was no denying it anymore. The damage had been done. Malone, standing beside him, looked like he wanted to disappear. His face had gone ashen, the color drained from his skin. His eyes darted around, avoiding contact with anyone, especially with Chief Anderson. He couldn't meet the gaze of the man who was about to determine his future. He could feel the sting of shame creeping up on him, and there was nowhere to hide. Jenkins, too, felt the weight of what was happening. His hands shook slightly, his grip tightening on the cuffs he had been carrying. The reality was sinking in, and there was no escape from it. They both knew what was coming. They both knew they were about to lose everything. Their careers, their reputations, their standing in the department, all of it was slipping away. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. Anderson didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his words was unmistakable. "You're both suspended," he said firmly. His words echoed in the air, each one a final nail in the coffin of Jenkins and Malone's careers. "And there will be a full investigation into your conduct. Now get back to the station and turn in your badges." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Jenkins opened his mouth, as if to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. There was no point in arguing. The chief had made his decision. And it wasn't just about the suspension. It wasn't just about the investigation. This was about accountability. This was about right and wrong. Jenkins realized, with a sickening feeling, that he couldn't defend his actions. Not anymore. They had crossed a line. They had made a choice, and now they had to face the consequences. For a moment, Jenkins and Malone stood in silence, the weight of the chief's words sinking in. The boy, Anderson's son, was still standing there, watching them with that calm, steady gaze. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He had seen everything, had known from the start what was going to happen. He had been the one to bear the brunt of their bullying, and now, in this moment, it was clear that he had won. Chief Anderson didn't look at either of them anymore. His gaze was fixed on the boy, a look of quiet respect in his eyes. It was a look that Jenkins and Malone had never earned. They hadn't earned the respect of their superior. They hadn't earned the trust of the department. They hadn't earned the right to stand there, to wear the badge they had once been so proud of. The chief's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the firmness in it. "I'm giving you a chance to leave here with some dignity," he said, his words ringing in the air. "You can walk out now and face the consequences with what little pride you have left. Or I can make this public. Your choice." Jenkins felt his stomach churn. He could feel the eyes of the boy on him, could feel the weight of the chief's gaze. He could hear the ticking of the clock in his head, counting down to the inevitable. He knew that the moment they turned in their badges, everything would change. He knew that this wasn't just about a suspension. This was about the rest of their lives. Malone finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll go," he said, his words empty, hollow. There was no fight left in him. There was no defiance, no anger. He had been broken, and he knew it. Jenkins nodded slowly, feeling numb. There was no other choice. He couldn't argue with the chief. He couldn't deny the truth anymore. The boy had been right. They had assumed, they had profiled, and now they had to pay the price. They walked slowly to the squad car, the weight of their badges feeling heavier with every step. They didn't speak to each other. There was nothing left to say. The realization of what had just happened hung in the air like a thick fog. They had failed. They had let themselves down, and they had let the people they were supposed to protect down. As they entered the station, the atmosphere was different. The usual sounds of chatter and paperwork felt distant, muted. Everyone knew what had happened, and they knew what was coming next. Jenkins and Malone walked to their desks, silently, and began the process of turning in their badges and their weapons. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around them. When Jenkins placed his badge on the desk, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It had been his identity. It had been his pride. And now, it was nothing more than a reminder of his failure. Malone did the same, his hand trembling as he placed his badge on the desk. There was no pride left in him. There was no satisfaction in the work they had done. All that was left was regret. As they left the station, Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't even imagine. The investigation would be thorough, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Their careers were over, but the damage they had done to themselves and the trust of the people they served would take much longer to heal. As the two officers slunk away, their heads hanging in shame, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like a heavy burden, the boy finally spoke again. His voice, quiet and steady, broke the silence. It was not directed at Jenkins or Malone but at the person who had been watching over him from the moment everything had gone wrong. It was to his father. "Thanks for stepping in," the boy said quietly, his eyes still locked on the retreating forms of the two officers. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of the situation. He hadn't needed his father's intervention in the sense that most people would, but there was something about the way his father had stood up for him, how he had revealed the truth, that made all the difference. Chief Anderson looked down at his son, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. He placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and pride. "You didn't need my help, son," he said, his voice steady and filled with quiet admiration. "You handled yourself just fine." The boy looked up at his father, his face still calm, but now there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. He hadn't needed his father to rescue him, he had been more than capable of standing his ground. But in that moment, with the realization that his father's words had backed up the truth, he felt a sense of validation that was beyond what he had expected. The two of them turned to walk away, their footsteps in sync, a silent understanding passing between them. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the city streets. The world around them seemed to exhale, the tension that had been hanging in the air slowly dissipating. The lesson had been learned. Not just by the officers, but by everyone who had witnessed the scene unfold. It was a lesson that, though simple, carried a weight far beyond the situation itself. Never underestimate someone based on how they look, because the quietest person might hold the most power. In a world where respect is earned, those who judge too quickly are often the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons. Jenkins and Malone had learned this lesson the hard way. They had assumed, based on nothing more than their own biases, that the boy was someone they could push around. They had treated him as though he didn't matter, as though his silence and calm demeanor were signs of weakness. But in reality, it was their own lack of understanding that had proven to be their downfall. As Chief Anderson and his son walked side by side, the boy's mind wandered for a moment. He thought about the officers' actions, about how they had assumed that, because of his appearance, he was someone to be feared, someone to be controlled. But he wasn't that person. He wasn't what they had made him out to be. And in that moment, he realized something important: sometimes, the quietest people are the ones who have the most strength. He wasn't angry with the officers. He didn't feel the need to hold a grudge. What had happened was a result of their own lack of empathy, their inability to see beyond their own assumptions. It wasn't his job to fix that. But he was grateful for the way things had unfolded. The situation had shown him that sometimes, standing firm, staying calm in the face of adversity, was the most powerful response. His father's presence had been a reminder that no matter what, he had people who believed in him, who understood him. Chief Anderson didn't need to rush in to save the day. The boy had known how to handle the situation all along. It wasn't about fighting back with anger or aggression, it was about remaining composed, about knowing your worth even when others tried to undermine it. And that, to him, was the most important lesson. People might judge you based on the way you look, the way you carry yourself, the assumptions they make about who you are. But none of that defines you. What defines you is how you carry yourself in the face of adversity, how you stand up for yourself without needing to prove anything to anyone else. What matters is how you stay true to who you are, even when the world around you tries to change that. As they walked down the street, the city seemed to breathe a little easier. The tension had lifted. The moment of justice had passed, but the ripple effects would be felt for much longer. The boy didn't need to say anything more. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. They didn't need to rush home. They didn't need to say anything else. They simply walked, side by side, knowing that in a world full of noise and judgment, sometimes silence was the most powerful statement you could make. The lesson wasn't just about the officers. It was about everyone who had witnessed the events unfold, everyone who had been a part of the story. It was a reminder that we should never judge someone based on superficial characteristics, that we should never assume that just because someone doesn't speak loudly or act in a way we expect, they are weak or incapable. People who are quiet, people who are calm, have stories and strength that we may never fully understand until we stop and listen. The boy's smile, small but knowing, was the final mark of the day. It wasn't just a smile of victory, it was a smile of understanding. He had known the whole time that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already won, not by fighting or resisting, but by simply being himself. By standing still, by being calm, he had shown the world that true strength doesn't come from force or loudness. It comes from self-assurance and from staying true to who you are, no matter the circumstances. Chief Anderson looked at his son, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. He had raised a son who knew the value of composure, who understood that power isn't always about what's in your hands or what you can take from others. True power comes from within, and it was clear that his son had mastered that lesson long before today. As they turned a corner and the street lights began to flicker on, casting their soft glow over the sidewalk, Chief Anderson spoke again. His voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You did well today," he said, his tone sincere. "I'm proud of you." The boy nodded, his smile returning. He didn't need to say anything in response. His actions had spoken for him. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The world wasn't always fair. There would always be people who judged others without understanding, people who saw only what they wanted to see. But as long as there were people who stood their ground, who refused to be defined by the opinions of others, there would always be hope. The boy had shown that. And as long as he continued to walk through life with the same quiet strength, the same calm assurance, he would continue to teach others the most important lesson of all: don't judge a book by its cover, and never underestimate the quietest person in the room. In the end, it wasn't about what had happened that day. It was about the future that was now open, filled with possibility, filled with the knowledge that real power comes not from the ability to control, but from the ability to stand firm in who you are. The boy had done that. And for that, he had won.